where is the Iranian Air Force in all of this? Now, they're flying antiques, the fencers that were shot down are 1960s vintage. They're my vintage. So they're not very capable. But even so, you'd have thought that you have an Air Force for the time you're going to fight a battle. But the reality is the Iranian Air Force is not doing anything, clearly been very effectively shot down by Qatar. That's also using its air defense missiles to shoot down a whole load of ballistic missiles and drones as well.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 7 of the 5th year, that's day 1469 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, we're very privileged once again to be talking to Sean Bell. Sean, former RAF fighter pilot. Well, you're the god of fighter pilots because it was Harrier jump jets that you flew. Former Air Vice Marshal in the RAF, co-founder of Red Matrix Productions and the High Ground podcast, and an ambassador for the RAF Association, and an old friend of the show. Sean, welcome back.
Philip, always a pleasure.
Now, there's nothing going on in the world at the moment, is there?
No. It's all very quiet, isn't it?
Yeah, so right, and therefore to conclude, no, actually, the Middle East has blown up. We're going to talk about the Middle East in a moment, but I've started off with the introduction around Ukraine, and Frontline is all about Ukraine. But you're looking at what's happening in the Middle East. What do you think Putin is making of this at the moment?
Well, it's always difficult. You and I sort of wrestle with how do you get inside President Putin's brain to actually work out what's actually going on. Both him and Trump, I think, are quite difficult to read. I think there are some interesting positives, though. One of the things that you and I have talked about Ukraine war is whether Russia's economy is going to be able to last. And that's largely based on fossil fuels. And because the West has put lots of sanctions over the sale of oil, Russia can only sell it. Shadow fleet discounts the market price. And the market price has been coming down, which has made life very difficult. In the last couple of days, you've seen the spike in the oil prices, and a lot of commentators talking about it potentially going up to $100 a barrel if the Straits of Hormuz remain blocked. All of that will be manna from heaven for President Putin, because there is a cost of extraction for this oil, and the price of it was only a little bit above that up until the start of this war in Iran. Now, all of a sudden, there's a massive margin to be made. So I think on one side, for financial reasons, it's good. And the other one, and we might get into this, is that I think we've entered a profound era where major superpowers appear to be able to do what they like. They don't have to subscribe to international law. And, America went in and snatched Maduro from Venezuela. They've now gone in and killed all the leadership of Iran without coming to the United Nations, without making the case about whether it's legal. And I do think it starts to explain in a way why President Trump seems to be more appeasing President Putin, because he sees him as a superpower doing what he thinks he needs to do, rather than actually betraying international law. So I think for a number of reasons, President Putin might feel a bit emboldened by the actions that are going on.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and I think we'll go down that international law rabbit hole, because there's an awful lot of people out there seem to think that international law, when it comes to starting wars and conflicts and all the rest of it, is very black and white. One side says, with all these conditions, how you can do it, and you go the other way, and you're suddenly committing an offence, and the international law police are going to come and arrest you for breaking international law. They seem to forget it's not like that. In that international law is up to the interpretation of it is up to each individual state, and if other states disagree with the interpretation, and I'm putting certain provisions aside, the Geneva Conventions and other things, there's no interpretation. But if other states disagree with it, they then take their grievances to either the International Criminal Court, because they're trying to accuse people of genocide, but not every country is signed up to that, so they're not subject to it. The United States isn't subject to it. Or they take it to the ultimate arbiter, which is the Security Council of the United Nations, of which there just happens to be 5 permanent members, and each permanent member has got a veto. And therefore, there is no sanction for the permanent members. And that is why Russia has got away with its illegal invasion of Ukraine. We call it illegal. It is under any definition that you could get there, but there's absolutely nothing that can be done under international law directly because of that. It's why China gets away with its expansionism around Southeast Asia, and it's why Donald Trump has got away with what he's done in Venezuela and effectively doing anything with impunity. So if you're on the P5 and the UK and France are the other two members, you can effectively get away with anything if you want to.
I think it's interesting, Philip, because I'm no lawyer, but you look at both of us throughout our military time, studied a little bit of military history, and if you look at, we lost, was it 70 million casualties in the Second World War, and after two world wars, the world superpowers sort of sat down and went, how do we avoid this happening again? How do we create a more internationally recognized framework, a rule of law, NATO being a defensive alliance, the United Nations a talking shop, International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, all of which were motivated by trying to make sure that nations didn't stumble into war again. And it sort of was supported by all. But as time's gone on, exactly as you say, we've got this irony now that, the United Nations is all about stopping wars, and yet one of the five major, veto holders is actually invading another country. It makes a mockery now of international law. And I think it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. Eventually, people get called out. And I think what we're seeing with Sir Keir Starmer now, nothing to do with politics, everything to do with being a prime minister, is having to tread the fine line of going, now as a nation, we try to operate within international law. It may not always work, but we try to. And therefore, when America asks us to support them on something where they haven't made the case that it's a legal act, international law is very clear. It's not it's not only the person who's wielding the gun, it's the person who's supporting him as well. It's equally complicit. And I think we shouldn't be bullied by America to get involved, but I do understand how difficult that is politically.
Yeah, I get that. And here's where I'm going to stray into very difficult territory. We just need to be careful about what we say here. But we are directly involved. We are assisting and have assisted the Americans in the preparation for this, because there are certain things that we and only we can do in support of the Americans, in particular in that region. And therefore, Keir Starmer turning around and saying we're not to the British public is because he's fence sitting, smacks to me of a bit of hypocrisy and him trying to keep his backbenchers online. And there's a difference between becoming materially involved greater than we are already, and what I mean by that is actually putting military forces to carrying out military offensive military action and in support, or helping an ally and allowing them to use the bases that you've already authorized them to have and to use and everything else, which keeps your position at the table so you can actually act as a conscience to them and try and keep them on the straight and narrow. Whereas if you refuse that and they won't let you at the table, you can't act as a conscience, and therefore potentially you've lost your influence. And this is where Keir Starmer, I think, is playing a very difficult game against his domestic political needs, his interpretation of international law, what we're actually doing and what we can influence. And I think it's going wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I was careful before I strayed into politics. You are more adept at that than I do think we've got to be careful not to get swept along by President Trump's sort of more bullying.
Oh, very much so.
And he does rather throw his weight around somewhat. I also think the legacy of history. You and I both joined militaries, which we're part of NATO. America was our biggest single ally. We did everything together with them because we shared values, we shared beliefs, and all of a sudden, therefore, if there is these moments now where America goes into Venezuela, plucks out the leadership, goes into Iran, kills the leadership, where does that stop? And are we going to be a lapdog to America, going right? I'm big and strong, I can do what I like, or do we try to find some counterpoint? And I think it's really difficult. I agree with you that it's incredibly difficult. But I also think, we're a lot closer to Iran geographically than America is. And whilst I heard with amusement several people saying, oh, Iran's ballistic missiles can't make it to the UK, their operational missiles can't make it to the UK, the ones that are declared. But you and I both know there's development programs in Iran that are looking at weapons to get all the way to the United States. And going beyond 3,000 kilometers, we're only just outside that. Pour a little bit more fuel in the rocket. It's, there are, and if we don't have any defenses in this country at all for ballistic missiles, and therefore I think we have to tread very carefully. If we believe it's the right thing to do, it's covered in international law. And don't get me wrong, Iran is a horrible, the leadership there, the Ayatollah, it'd be responsible for awful things. But I think we've got to be quite careful that we think by putting a McDonald's on every street corner and giving women the vote, that suddenly democracy will spread out. Because regime changes in Iraq, regime changes in Libya, they haven't worked that well, have they?
Not in the slightest. And people forget that the sovereign base areas on Cyprus are sovereign base areas. They are UK national territory, and of course we've got Gibraltar, which is a sovereign base area as well, and therefore we've got a lot of UK sovereign territory within easy striking distance, and we've seen RAF Akrotiri, which is on one of the sovereign base areas, actually being hit by drones that have come from not necessarily Iran directly, but the reports I'm reading are from Iranian Hezbollah, who have fired them in. But Hezbollah are an Iranian proxy. They are an arm of the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Quds Force, as Hamas is, as the Houthis are, as are a number of the different groups throughout Iraq.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out, Philip, though, I'm glad you brought that up, because when that news first broke, there was talk of an explosion, the runway, moving all the families off Cyprus and the like. Inevitably, as a talking head for the Ministry of Defence, I get involved, I still keep security clearance, you get involved in quite a lot of briefings. I got involved in one yesterday, and what appeared to be the case, that inevitably the truth gets lost. The first casualty of war is the truth.
It's the truth, as always.
There was a drone, or they thought it was a drone. It actually didn't hit the runway. It hit a hangar that's on Cyprus. It didn't explode. There was some debris around. There were no casualties, and it had no impact whatsoever on what was going on. But it's also worth pointing out that whilst we can't go into details, there are American personnel semi-permanently based on Cyprus. And therefore, if Iran was lashing out at American assets, it's not entirely beyond the wit of man that they would have a go at those American assets. And they did apparently hit one of the US buildings there. So as a result, now it does appear, as you say, that this came from Lebanon. Now, almost certainly, therefore, it's Hezbollah, and therefore it's got the shadow of Iran on it. But I think we've got to be quite careful to suddenly make the leap of faith that the UK is in the sights, when in fact it was quite possible. It's a bit like we're on Al Udeid. Doesn't mean we're the target. Al Udeid is the target, and it's America the primary focus.
Well, this is where my other concern goes, and this is the one where, for those that are listening in the UK and across Europe, you should be watching for, because this is where we are in the sights of Iran, is if we suddenly start to see an uptick of Islamist focused terrorism, because Donald Trump has been very clear. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terror across the globe, and he's 100% right in that. And we see that across the Middle East with, we've mentioned Hezbollah, I mentioned Hamas, I mentioned the Houthis, the different groups across Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. But the Quds Force have also got their tentacles into other different organizations across Europe and in the UK and in the United States. And those organizations have got the potential to stimulate terror attacks inside our countries. And that would be the next logical level, I would suggest, if Iran wanted to try and attack and cause disruption in countries, and something we should be vigilant about.
No, but I think you raise an interesting point, which is, you and I both know, military is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And so what is the end state? What is it that Trump wants to... Now, he made it very clear. I want to make sure Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, and he talked about regime change. Now, we can get into each of those. I've never seen regime change work from airborne, from air.
You've got my next question. Can the Air Force, can air power itself bring in regime change?
The short answer is no. But let's go back to, if you want regime change, I think what was spectacular is Iran's had its network infiltrated by Israel, very much like Hezbollah, and day one, they went, right, we now know where all the key leadership are, we need to go. I was surprised to see the Tomahawk missiles and the attacks happening in broad daylight. That never happens. almost certainly because it was intelligence-led. We've got these guys, and the proof of the pudding was they severed the heads off. Now, I was quite surprised then why President Trump didn't say, right, stop. We've now demonstrated what we can do. We are going to have an next round of talks, but we're not going to have any more messing about, because the longer actually what goes on, Iran hunkers down. It's not easy to see how America draws this to a close, because America's probably going to run out of weapons pretty soon. It's still trying to help Ukraine in the fight against Russia. They've also got to keep some in reserve. So it's quite difficult to see the longer this goes on. All Iran has to do is not lose. And that feels to me very, very possible.
Yeah. Do you think this is part of the reason why Donald Trump was very reluctant to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, in that in the back of his mind he had, I'm going to need the stocks that we've got if we decide to do anything in Iran, and I'm thinking I'm going to have to do something in Iran. And also, interestingly, President Zelensky in the last 24 hours has turned around and said, in his advice to Middle East countries, be careful with your stocks of your very expensive, very capable missiles, and shooting them at the Shahad drones and all the rest of it, because you're going to run out of them. And that's when Iran will start to unleash its ballistic and its hypersonic missiles at your key targets and key infrastructure. It's interesting that we're getting the lessons coming out from President Zelensky, and indicators could suggest, and I'm hugely speculating here, that Donald Trump's reason for not supplying Tomahawk cruise missiles was he had them earmarked for another activity, which is this one.
Yeah, maybe, but you and I know that the stocks of Tomahawk cruise missiles are meant to be around 5,000. I don't suppose we're looking at those sorts of numbers being used in this conflict. I think there is an interesting... Somebody said to me that American stocks of Patriot and THAAD missiles are considerably smaller than the Iranian supplies of ballistic missiles. In other words, you can't shoot them all down. And of course, you can't produce these things very quickly. They take years. You can't nip down to Walmart and I'll just fill up the trolley with a few more missiles. You've got some of them over in Ukraine being held. There's a lot of European countries that have Patriot. You've got Americans got Patriots. Now all of a sudden you're trying to protect the Middle East. Those limited supplies are going to run out pretty quickly. And I suspect that's why, from a military perspective, you're seeing a huge effort to find not only the launchers in Iran, but also the production facilities and the storage facilities, because you want to get these things before they get launched and therefore preserve your air defense capability.
So from an airman's perspective, how complex is the operation that will have gone in on day one, when we had that combined US and Israeli air attacks going in against the Iranian targets, and how complex then does the continuation of this sort of air operation lend itself to be?
Well, yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at this. I think it's relatively simple. The Americans did this last year. They rolled back the Iranian air defense systems and basically had control of the air, so they could actually operate air power over Tehran with impunity. And it's not like, again, Iran can't nip down to the shops and restock everything. So America now knows where everything is, knows where the holes are. And that first wave was literally just destroying Iran's ability to defend itself. What was interesting, I say in parallel, was this whole intelligence-led, Israeli-led, let's go and get the leadership out. I think what's now interesting is, okay, so what are the targets now? America seems to be focusing on Iran's ability not only to mess around the Straits of Hormuz, but also its ability to launch more missiles. We're not hearing very much about attacking the nuclear capability, the ability to enrich uranium. But I think if I was Iran now, you're looking at, do I just hunker down? Do I keep fighting? And how do you bring this to an end? Because the problem is, as you say, the longer this goes on, the more terrorism will start to rear its ugly head. Whereas actually, you've done what you've set out to do, which is to do effectively regime change. And don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that that Iran's going to be a fantastic country, but you've made absolutely clear that that behavior won't be tolerated. And from an American perspective, if you could get a negotiation around the nuclear, not form a nuclear weapon. And then my last thought about this, Philip, is we paint Iran as a bad guy for wanting a nuclear weapon. let's look at the situation between Russia and Ukraine. If Ukraine had still got its nuclear weapons, it was the third largest nuclear power 25 years ago. We persuaded them, the Russians, the Americans, the Brits, to give them up. That was the Budapest memo, in a guarantee that we would never attack. 20 years later, Russia attacked. So if you were anyone in the world now, you'd go, the only way to guarantee my security is to have nuclear weapons. And therefore, you would play all these negotiations long because you know your national survival depended on it. I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining why it won't just be Iran that's looking to pursue nuclear weapons.
No, I agree with you completely. Our failure to uphold the Budapest Memorandum and provide those security guarantees to Ukraine will have stimulated a nuclear arms race, and it's a lot of little countries that will be wanting to get them in any way, shape, or form. And this is where the nuclear argument into Iran is quite interesting. The Americans may have destroyed their ability to enrich uranium, but Steve Witkoff apparently said on US television last night that the Iranian negotiators had said at the very beginning that we still got 460 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which is enough to make about 11 nuclear warheads. And that was as part of the opening gambit of the negotiations that were going on. Now, whether that is accurate or not, I don't know, because I've only seen it in one post and haven't been able to verify that. But that's not a good start. And then, of course, what price has Russia had to pay to Iran for Iran's support? Has it transferred nuclear technology to Iran? And that's the other worrying thing.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. There's lots of different. I was going to just return briefly to your question, though, about the role of air power, because I think we're seeing some of my army colleagues, you and I, probably over the years have gone, yeah, air power can do this, but you need boots on the ground to provide permanence. To have, air power is transitory. Boots is, and I don't see any appetite for putting boots on the ground. The other challenge with air power is we've seen over the last 24 hours, we watched 3 American F-15s get shot down by friendly fire. 3, one is unlucky, 2 a bit unfortunate, 3 all in quick succession. We've also
have you ever seen the Kuwaiti military operating? I'm sure you have.
Well. Yeah, but I remember the Gulf War when we were flying out of Kuwait off to Iraq, and we were more worried about the American defense systems as we came back home than we were about the Iraqi system. It's also worth pointing out that, of course, Kuwait is a relatively small country. There's not that much airspace there to play with. Most of the military jets flying around are flying the same sort of speed as the cruise missiles or whatever. And because Iran is launching lots of stuff, and you haven't had much time to train to make sure you've got a really well coordinated, it isn't a great surprise. Luckily, all the aircrew got out, and I was relieved to hear that Qatar actually managed to shoot down 2 Fencer aeroplanes. And I think one of the questions I'd have was, where is the Iranian Air Force in all of this? Now, they're flying antiques. The Fencers that were shot down are 1960s vintage. They're my vintage. So they're not very capable. But even so, you'd have thought that you have an Air Force for the time you're going to fight a battle. But the reality is the Iranian Air Force is not doing anything, clearly being very effectively shot down by Qatar. That's also using its air defense missiles to shoot down a whole load of ballistic missiles and drones as well. So it's a complicated picture. But in answer to your question, no, I do not believe air power alone will be able to enable regime change in Iran.
Yeah, you say Fencer's your era. The SR-71 is your era as well, and you're more an SR-71 man in technology terms from that period of time. For those that don't know what the SR-71 is, it's that Blackbird, the spy plane that flies on the edge of space. That the Americans had. That can one of the most fascinating videos I've seen is whenever it's sitting there beside I think there were some F-15s or F-18s, and all of a sudden they decided to put their afterburners on, and the F-18s were at maximum thrust, and they just put his afterburners on and just disappeared away off into the horizon, which was fantastic. But yeah, it's fascinating to see everything, and I think the majority of the Iranian Air Force has been destroyed on the ground. It's incapable of flying because it can't be serviced and everything else. And Iran is going to rely more and more on its missile capability, whilst it's still got a coherent military. Yesterday they lost 11 ships because the Americans concentrated on them, and that missile capability, once that starts to get denuded, then they're going to have to go to more asymmetric tactics, and that's when the really worrying stuff, I think, will happen, not just regionally but across the world.
But the other question, if I would bounce back to you, I'd say, what do you see the role of Israel in this? Because there is a sense at the moment that Israel's got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to degrade Iran. And the danger is, when does that stop being just retribution rather than a measured view to make? Because the further you denude Iranian's military capability, the more you potentially kill civilians, the more potentially you turn Iranians against America and Israel, rather than being seen as the liberators. There is a time here where I think prudence might be very powerful. I'm just wondering how that's going to happen.
Well, and again, the one thing that Iran's response to the initial attacks has done is it's united the countries across the Middle East in a way that they've never been united before, because they've all been attacked. But if we then get into, as you say, a longer game where there's more civilian targets, that Iran starts to look more like Gaza looks and all the rest of it, then that support is going to wane very, very quickly indeed. And Israel's got an opportunity, but I think the opportunity here would be a proper regime change. And the one thing that is a little glimmer of hope, it's no more than a little spark that you see flashing every now and again, is unlike Libya and Iraq, actually there is a potential government in waiting that could come in that's been planning for something like this for many, many years. And that's the son of the Shah of Iran, who has got a plan to bring in a constitutional type monarchy with free and fair democratic elections across Iran. But the conditions are not right with the government, with the replacement for the Grand Ayatollah, because there's still relatively senior and coherent structures within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and within the religious structure that's there that has supported the government. So they have to go through several machinations of that before that is dismantled. And whilst that's still there, then the people in Iran can't rise up. And I'm not getting any impression that there is something stimulating them and getting them ready to rise up. I'd hope that Israeli and US intelligence services are on the ground and trying to stir that up. Otherwise, regime change isn't going to happen. Full stop.
No, and I do think that sometimes you and I are old enough to know that these things are often not black and white, that they are shades of grey. And if you go from a regime that's the Ayatollah, hard line, hard over, in an ideal world, maybe from a Trump perspective, the whole regime disappears. But actually, if you simply create a set of conditions where the dial is turned a bit, and all of a sudden the new regime may still be pretty brutal, but actually recognises that it can't be as hardline as their predecessors, then maybe you see an evolution rather than a revolution. Maybe you see the country starting to walk a slightly different path. And I do think I'm old enough. I'm not an idealist. I'm a pragmatist, and that's why I was quite hopeful at the time that once the Ayatollah was dead and the key leadership, that just seemed like a window of opportunity now to pause and potentially see a more positive path. The further we go down this, Trump doesn't win because of the midterm elections. He's been trying to leave his legacy as the president of peace. Well, he's just caused the biggest carnage in the Middle East for generations. And we've seen, so far, I think it's only 4 US servicemen died. But the longer this goes on, Iran only has to be lucky once. And all of a sudden, you end up with a very different narrative. And the longer this goes on, the more likely that is, it appears to me, to happen.
So with America potentially running out of weapons, and it's high value weapons and all the rest of it because it's using them here, what do you think Xi Jinping's going to do with regard to Taiwan? Do you think he's biding his time and suddenly going, I've now got a window of opportunity myself as a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations to go and do something?
Well, it's very difficult to see how this would dissuade Xi Jinping. I mean, I think President Trump, as we opened, really, has made it clear that if you're a major superpower and you're powerful, you can basically do what you like. You don't have to ask the United Nations. You don't have to subscribe to international law. You just say, look, you justify that Iran is wrong, bad leadership, we're going to go in and sort it out. Well, in the same way, China will now feel, I think, emboldened. And I think if you look at the US national security strategy, it paints China less as an enemy and more of America focused on the sort of Western hemisphere, and its interest in the West. China focused on the Eastern Hemisphere, and Middle Earth, Russia and Europe fight for that middle ground. And I think China will, I'm pretty sure, they'll feel emboldened because America has now set the ground rules. It's very difficult for America to complain about China going to Taiwan when it's been walking into countries, sweeping aside international law. And I think if I was the Chinese leadership, you'd believe that you're going to go into Taiwan eventually. So the question is when? And actually, you need to seize windows of opportunity when the pain is likely to be at the minimum. And at the moment, it would feel, goodness knows, none of us want to see this happen, but it feels like one of those windows has opened up. And therefore, I wouldn't be at all surprised if China's going, is this the time?
And finally, because I think we're coming towards the end of our time, what does this all mean for Middle Earth, as you described it, but the war that's going on in Middle Earth between Russia and Ukraine? What does all this mean for Ukraine?
Yeah, with a limited time, I think, as we go into the 5th year, I think if you and I, when we first started talking about this conflict, it was Ukraine's not in NATO. Why has it got anything to do with us? We'll try and help them out a bit. If you now look at the way that world has divided up, the collapse of the international order, actually, you can see Russia and Ukraine being an existential fight for the European mainland in the way that history guides us. And can we rely on America's help to help sort it out if it was to go worse? I think our confidence has reduced that that's the case. I think we're not the United States of Europe, but we've got to find a way of operating more closely together from a military perspective, because divided, we are very vulnerable. Together, we could be incredibly powerful. And finally, I think, we as an island nation, we've still got remnants of our empire, as you said, British sovereign bases around the world. But now we've left the European Union. It's very difficult to see where our economy is thriving. Where is the growth? Where's the engine? We've suddenly found ourselves to be an island, not only politically, but also militarily and geographically. And I do think we've got to work out where we sit in the world, because the number one priority for any government is defending our people. And at the moment, I think we're more vulnerable today than we've been in a generation. And that is a major challenge for the government and us in the public to address.
Well, on that note, and I have to agree with you, Sean Bell, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Thanks, Phil. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline. Now, in case you haven't heard, we've got our own channel now. So please subscribe whenever subscriptions start again. But of course, you can still listen to us if you want to on Times Radio at 01:35 hours in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. But that is 20:35 Eastern Standard Time for those in the United States. And of course, please put your comments in and share our link with your friends. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.